On to something else. Let's now look at the importance of fossils. So the importance of fossils. We want to look at the importance of fossils in as far as this area is concerned, and we shall actually be able to first say that when fossils are found in a particular environment, they always give us a particular evidence, a direct evidence of the type of animals and plants that existed at a particular or certain geological age. So, tell us more about plants and animals that existed at a particular geological age or period. That tells you more about the plants and animals that existed at a particular geological period. If I find a fossil or a remain or an ancestral form of a particular organism, such as a mosses or even a dog, that means a list of mosses and a dog can tell me more about what really existed at that particular period. If I find a fossil or a fern plant in a particular area, or I find a cow in a particular environment as a waste or a remain or a fossil, then that tells me that the mosses plants in this list or category and the dog, the fern plant, the cow, or the man existed at a particular environment at a particular geological period. So tell us more about or give us an evidence of the plants and animals that existed at a particular geological period. Number two, this also can confirm to us that different groups of organisms, arose. You can also say came into existence. Came into existence at different times on Earth. Different groups of organisms arose or came into existence at different times on this planet called Earth. I would want to use this example to explain this. Which example do I want to use? I would actually be able to say that Kingdom Monera, for example, that has members referred to as bacteria, was the first one to exist or to arise on the Earth's surface. The second kingdom to follow on this or to follow suit was Kingdom Protoctista, also referred to as Kingdom Protista, that can actually have members such as Paramecium, Plasmodium, Amoeba. We have Spirogyra, we have Euglena, we have Chlamydomonas, Trypanosome, and Vorticella, or the seaweeds, or even the Sargassum. All of them are actually able to fall under this kingdom, and they are the actual members that had the second rising on the Earth's surface. The third category to arise was that of kingdom fungi. The yeast, the bracket fungi, we have what we call the toadstool, we have the mushroom, the puffball, were the members of kingdom fungi that had the third arising on the earth's surface. The fourth category to arise was that of the plants, and lastly, the animals came last in as far as the order in which the organisms arose on the earth's surface is concerned. So the last category of organisms to arise on the earth's surface was that of the animals. Now, it can also be able to get associated with this to mean that sometimes you can look at the vertebrates, for example, and you realize that if researchers to get done, the oldest fossils are those of the fishes. So the fishes first existed, for example, as vertebrates, animals with a backbone. The second category was able to be that of the amphibians. Remember, the fishes follow this aspect of being able to appear as the first organisms on the Earth's surface. So they must be having the oldest fossils. Look at that. So in other words, if someone has to do research, like the archaeologists, and they find some bacteria in the Earth's surface together with members of kingdom Protoctista, like the Paramecium, they realize that the fossils of bacteria would seem to be the oldest than those of the Paramecium under kingdom Protoctista, to show that Monera has been able to get given as an example that had the earliest arising on the Earth's surface. If I compare plants and animals in terms of their fossils, I'll realize that the fossils of plants would be the oldest, followed by the fossils of animals. I mean, plants had an early rising on the Earth's surface, then followed by the animals. If I compare the fossils of fishes and amphibians, the fossils of fishes would seem to be the oldest, then later on the amphibians, to mean that the fishes had the earlier arising, followed by the amphibians. And progressively, we had the mammals being the last to arise on the Earth's surface. Now, that tells you that fossils can tell us more about the arising of organisms on the Earth's surface. Number three, you can actually use fossils to tell the phylogenetic relationship. You can tell more about phylogenetic phylogenetic relationship phylogenetic relationship between organisms. Phylogenetic relationship between organisms. That means that I can be able to actually understand that organisms must have had a similar or common origin depending on the similarities between their fossils. Let me use this example. If I have to compare the fossils of a monkey and the fossils of man, I'll realize that the fossils of a monkey and those of a man must have a greater resemblance. Why? Because these organisms have a similar origin. They have a phylogenetic relationship. Their phylogeny can get well discussed in terms of the way their fossils have a greater similarity. So a monkey and a man have a similar origin. They must have come from the same ancestral form because of the greater similarities between their fossils. And their ancestral form was referred to as proconsul. Look at that. So, man and monkey have the same ancestral form called proconsul, to confirm to us that they have a similar origin in terms of their evolution. So, fossils can tell us more about the relationship of the organisms in relation to their origin. Now, what could be the other advantage of fossils? What could be the other advantage of fossils? Fossils can tell us as well more about the increase in the complexity of the organisms. So, tell us more about the increase in the complexity of organisms. That means that if fossils have to get compared, you'd actually realize that there was evolution. Organisms were to actually evolve from simple life forms to complex life forms. For example, if I decide to look at the remains of Dryopithecus or Australopithecus, and I tend to compare with the remains of Homo habilis, for example, I move to maybe Homo erectus. Look at that. So Homo habilis, then I move to remains of Homo erectus, and lastly Homo sapiens. What comes into my mind? The remains of the Dryopithecus or the Australopithecus and the remains of Homo sapiens are not the same. A remain of Homo sapien would be more complex compared to the remains of a Dryopithecus. So this would actually give me a simple life form, but this would give me what you call a complex life form to confirm that there was evolution. So this would be the first evidence of evolution, that organisms had their previous remains being so simple, but now later on, due to evolution, their remains became more complex. So a relationship between a Homo sapiens and a Dryopithecus can be well explained in terms of the complexity. You get the point. So a Dryopithecus was one of the earliest forms of man, the simplest form of man. But after evolution, we had to actually end up becoming very complex in terms of our structures. To confirm that, we underwent evolution. Now, we can also be able to actually realize that because of this, if I actually have to dig out some of these remains, I'll realize that the younger rock strata in the earth surface would have fossils which are more complex. I repeat, the younger rock strata just at the topmost parts of the earth's surface would have more complex fossils. But the older, look at that, the older rock strata just at the lower part of the earth's surface would have simple fossils or simple forms of fossils. To confirm that, these would be now the most recent organisms occupying the younger rock strata because their fossils are more complex. This would represent the earliest forms, which are very simple. To confirm that, they are actually the earliest, the oldest, and these are the most recent. So the most recent complex forms of life occupy the younger rock strata in the Earth's surface. But the simple earliest life forms have to actually end up getting found in the older rock strata. You get the point? That is a confirmation that actually there has been evolution. There has been evolution. There has been evolution. So I would expect to find Dryopithecus just in the older rock strata, which is the simplest form of life for man. And I would find Homo sapiens in the younger rock strata, just at the topmost part of the Earth's surface. Very good. So we would also move to something else, which is going to be dating of fossils. Dating of fossils. Dating of fossils. So with the dating of fossils, we always use a method called radioactive dating. This is a method that is used to date fossils, to determine the age of fossils. Why do we use the radioactive dating as a method used to determine the age of fossils? How old would this Australopithecus be? N backdating. N determination of the age of a particular remain or ancestral form can get done using a method called radioactive dating. And in the recent dating, we have what you call radioactive carbon dating. Then, the general method is called radioactive dating. But now, a more advanced and definite method that we can actually explain in this manner is what we refer to as the radioactive carbon dating. Why do we even add carbon? Because at the end of the day, what we are going to determine is the age of fossils. And the fossils of what and what? Fossils of plants and animals. And these two organisms contain carbon. That's why the method is more advanced and can get called radioactive carbon dating. Why carbon dating? Because the remains of both plants and animals contain carbon. Remember, during photosynthesis, plants always use carbon dioxide to manufacture food. At the end of the day, they will actually contain carbon. The food they manufacture is in the simplest form referred to as glucose. For example, the chemical formula of glucose is C6H12O6. In this molecule, there is carbon. So plants use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from animals to manufacture food. They will use carbon dioxide. So their end product, and as far as food getting manufactured by these organisms, will contain carbon. Now, remember, animals are heterotrophic, to mean they don't make their own food. They will rely on what plants has actually manufactured. So if a plant manufactures food, the food can actually get supplied to animals. So animals depend on plants in as far as their nutrition is concerned. So they're heterotrophic, but plants are autotrophic. If plants are autotrophic, they will make their own food. If animals are heterotrophic, they will depend on already manufactured food. So if they actually end up depending on plants as a source of food, they will be taking in carbon. We shall take glucose from plants, we shall take proteins, and many proteins also contain carbon. Look at that. So at the end of the day, plants do contain carbon because of the carbon dioxide they use to make their own food. Animals do contain carbon because of the carbon they obtain from the food they eat from plants. We know very well that the building blocks of proteins are amino acids. Look at that. And of course, an amino acid must contain carbon. The longest carbon chain must be present in the structure of these compounds or these organisms. So radioactive carbon dating is used to determine the age of fossils of both plants and animals. We are saying carbon because both plants and animals contain carbon. Now as we proceed forward, we should also capture this. The age of very old fossils. Age of very old fossils. Fossils getting dated millions and millions of years ago. Their age can get determined by using what we call the potassium argon method. So age of very old fossils is obtained by determining how old the fossils are by using the potassium argon method. Potassium argon method. So if I want just to determine the age of a recent fossil or not a very old fossil in the environment, maybe a plant that died or an animal that died some 100 years ago, I can use the radioactive carbon dating. Why carbon? Because both plants and animals contain carbon. Plants use carbon dioxide to make food, so they contain carbon, while animals feed on what the plants have actually manufactured, so they also contain carbon. So, very old fossils, fossils dated back millions of years ago, can get determined in terms of their age by using what we call the potassium argon method. Now, we want to actually ask ourselves, if you're using fossils to tell us or to actually confirm to ourselves that there must have been evolution, what would be the most possible limitations of using fossils as an evidence of evolution? Because at the end of the day, you realize that fossils have their own weaknesses. Fossils have their own weaknesses in as far as the evidence of evolution is concerned. Number one, there are limitations of using fossils. Limitations of using fossils. Limitations of using fossils to actually give us an evidence of evolution. Number one, you can talk about missing fossil records. Missing fossil records. These are majorly referred to as missing links. Missing fossil records or missing links. This means that some remains can get decomposed. Decomposed remains. You see, you are looking for a remain of a Homo habilis, but accidentally, that remain in the Earth's surface has completely been decomposed. That link is missing. I cannot be able to actually understand the transition of the process of evolution, maybe from a Drypithecus to a Homo erectus. Why? Because I know I may have Homo habilis here, then there's a missing link here. Why? A Homo erectus might have been decomposed completely. Then I'm actually going to what we call the Homo sapiens. So, some fossils are missing. If these fossils miss, can I understand the process of evolution? Can I know where I have to actually move to when I move from the Homo habilis? No. Why? Because the Homo erectus is missing. Homo erectus is missing, but Homo habilis is present. Homo sapiens is present. So that means missing fossil records, missing links because of the remains getting decomposed can actually make us to find it so difficult to understand the transition in terms of the evolution or the changes in the complexity of the structures of organisms when they're actually undergoing evolution. So some fossils are missing, some fossils cannot be able to get traced because maybe they might have actually been decomposed. Or sometimes the remains might have been scavenged on. The predators might have eaten the remains. At the end of the day, the missing links can actually exist. When missing links exist, then that means it will be difficult for you to understand the process of evolution. Like understanding that this organism evolved from this stage to this stage, then from this stage to this stage, then lastly from this stage to this stage. If one link misses, if some fossil remains miss, you cannot get a better picture, a clear picture of how this organism underwent evolution from one stage to another. Or sometimes some remains may have failed to fossilize. That means there were no appropriate conditions for civilization. You can say there were no appropriate conditions for fossilization. No appropriate conditions for fossilization. No appropriate conditions for fossilization. So, what are some of the disadvantages or limitations of using fossil records to show that there's evolution? One, we've said some fossils can be missing, which we can always be able to refer to as missing links. So fossils are missing, or we are what we call missing links. So if fossils are missing, or what we call missing links, then that means those fossils might have either one been decomposed, either completely broken down by bacteria and fungi, or some of these fossils may have been scavenged on or eaten by predators, or some of these fossils may have lacked appropriate conditions for forming or fossilization. At the end of the day, if those fossils miss, we can understand the process of evolution from one stage to another because of the missing fossil records. The second disadvantage is distortion distortion of parts of remains distortion of parts of remains during sedimentation distortion of parts of remains during sedimentation. This was a structure of maybe a cat, you see, just as a remain in the earth's surface. Then some parts get distorted. Look at that. So maybe the limbs end up missing, or the hind gets to that point of missing, or there are no ears. So if some parts of this animal get distorted as a remain, what happens? We cannot get a clear picture of evolution because majorly we are looking at the structures of the organism to understand the aspect of evolution. If the Homo habilis was walking maybe on fours, and the Homo sapiens ends up walking on twos, and accidentally I realized that the remains of Homo habilis and the remains of Homo sapiens have no limbs. Would I understand the process of evolution? No, because I'm basically going to look at the structures. So if some of these structures are distorted, if some parts of the remains are distorted because of this sedimentation process, you see, you'll end up not having a clear impression or picture of how evolution has actually occurred or how the structures have become complex from their initial simple forms. So some parts can get distorted during sedimentation, making us to have a wrong impression of the structures. Now, next, we have what we call distortion. Distortion of fossils by geological or geographical activities. Distortion of fossils by geological or geographical activities. Some of these geographical activities can be maybe faulting, we are folding, we have earthquakes. Those can be some of the, or just uplifting or the mass movements within our Earth's surface. So all these can actually be able to distort the fossils. Once fossils are distorted, we cannot have a clear picture of the structures of the organisms and be able to do what we call a comparison to determine whether there must have been evolution as far as these organisms are concerned. Very good. So I would want just to give some history of how organisms evolved in terms of the human beings. And it is believed, in as far as Charles Darwin's research or writings are concerned, that the earliest being was referred to as proconsul. Remember, this data has been captured in his books. In one of the books you can be able to actually look at is what you call the descent of man. So in the book The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin proposed that human beings, Homo sapiens, descended from ape-like structures. In his book The Descent of Man, he says that man, the reason man now, the Homo sapiens, descended from ape-like structures. And we've been actually looking for evidence for this to support this theory, so that at the end of the day we can be able to have a clear picture of how man evolved. So in the book Descent of Man, written by Charles Darwin, he says that the recent human being, now the man, the Homo sapiens, came or originated from the ape-like structures that have actually to get captured here in my next discussion. So he says the earliest ancestor was referred to as proconsul. Proconsul underwent changes to give us one hominidae and pongidae. And the pongidae gave rise to chimpanzee. The pongidae gave rise to chimpanzee. Information. Then also the monkey. Then the orangutan. But now, fortunately, the hominidae gave rise to man. In other words, man and monkey must have had the same origin. They came from the same ancestral form. They came from the same ancestral form. So monkey, chimpanzee, and orangutan are under an ape-like structure called the pongidae. Man under an ape-like structure called hominidae. They all come from the same ancestral form called proconsul. Very good. And you also need to understand that from this aspect, we can actually have this discussion. You'll realize that some of the earliest forms of ape-like structures that man had actually arise from were like the Australopithecus. I've mentioned about that. Australopithecus. That is something very, very important for you to note. We can also be able to talk about Sahelopithecus or Sahelanthropus. Sahelanthropus. We have Homo habilis. We have Homo erectus. We have Homo sapiens. We have the modern man. So Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens. We have what you call the modern man. So these are some of the ways in which you can be able to actually explain this. In other words, at the end of the day, we've looked at how the proconsul gave rise to hominidae and pongidae. Hominidae gave rise to the modern man, who must have come from the ape-like structures like Australopithecus, Sahelanthropus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and now there is a man. The pongidae, as the other ape-like structure, ended up giving rise to the monkey, the chimpanzee, and the orangutan. So all these are actually able to come from the same ancestral form. So they must have some sort of what you call resemblance. Okay, so we would want actually to look at some structural differences between modern man and the ape-like creatures that must have had an earlier existence. So if the ape is put here, and we actually put here the modern man or the human,